And we'll begin with a very important question in Jewish life that will affect all of our discussions of what it means to be Jewish and how to be Jewish. And that is the core question, what are the Jews? Are they a people? Are they a religion? Are they a cultural group? Are they some other variety of entity? Well, we have to find the right vocabulary so that we can understand what we have in common with other members of that category, whatever our designation or determination has been. So we'll start today by talking about what are the Jews, and then later in this morning's session, we'll turn to the experiences of Jews living in Alexandria in Egypt during the Hellenistic period, some 2,000 years ago, because in many ways they highlight some of the challenges that Jewish diversity presents both within the Jewish community and also beyond it, and also some of the challenges that we face, particularly as secular and humanistic Jews. And so we continue with a very basic statement when it comes to understanding the Jews. And that is that the concept of looking Jewish doesn't make any sense. It never made any sense if you really had a global picture of who the Jews were. But asking that question, what is a Jew, is complicated, because we are not only a religion. You can know that a number of different ways. A religion, it doesn't make sense necessarily to identify you as born to a religion. If a religion is a set of beliefs and ritual practices, can you be born to believe something? And we use phrases all the time, like so-and-so is a member of the tribe. Well, that's not a religious identity. That's a different kind of identity. Now, let's say you go to the other extreme and say, well, it's just an ethnic group. Well, that's also complicated, as we'll see, because of our visual and cultural diversity, but also because what kind of ethnic group do you join by a religious conversion? What ethnic group is recognized as one of the world's three great monotheistic religions? So we have aspects of both. We have aspects of a ethnic, national, biological peoplehood identity and aspects of a religious identity that help to define what it means to be Jewish, to become Jewish, to stay Jewish, and so on. But while I find those categories meaningful of being Jewish, becoming Jewish, doing Jewish, the category of looking Jewish should be something we retire very quickly. And I'll give you just a few examples here. So first off, we have this picture. This is what people conventionally assume looking Jewish looks like. In fact, some people even would see this and say, oh, he must be a rabbi. Of course, he's not a rabbi necessarily. That's what ultra-Orthodox Jewish men look like, whether they're rabbis or ordinary ultra-Orthodox Jews. But the idea of the black hat and the beard and the generally white skin, that's the stereotype of looking Jewish. But of course, this person also, quote, looks Jewish. She looks to me, just by raw skin color typing, to be perhaps from a North African Jewish background or a Middle Eastern Jewish background. She's wearing Israeli army uniform, of course. Some previous seminar participants in a version of the seminar noticed her nails are done very well. But this is another example of looking Jewish. And here's another set of people looking Jewish. These are members of the Beta Yisrael, the Ethiopian Jewish community we'll be talking about tomorrow morning. And they are Jews living in Israel, speaking Hebrew as a daily language, practicing Jewish religion, reading Jewish literature in religious and secular ways, singing Jewish music and creating Jewish music for that matter. But again, they don't fit what the stereotype, the American Jewish stereotype certainly, of looking Jewish is. Now, this maybe fits more in the Tel Aviv suburbanite North American model, using your phone while driving, of course. But this person is also an American Jew. He goes by the pen name Ma Nishtana, what is different, if you couldn't guess. He actually, as I understand, has rabbinic ordination as well. But he's a very public Jewish intellectual who talks about the intersection of his identity as both being a black man in America and also being Jewish and being a black Jew in a Jewish community that sees Jewishness as having a meaningful category called looking Jewish. Now, here's an example of a campaign poster from recent Israeli elections. This is for a Russian Jewish party. You can tell by the alphabet on the ad. But notice, you can see how the faces are a little bit different. The coloring is different, but this is another example of a Jewish face. And this last one may surprise you. This woman is Jewish. She was actually born to a father born Ashkenazi Jewish and a mother who was born Korean. She herself underwent, as I understand, an Orthodox conversion, conservative conversion. But she herself is a Reform rabbi. She's the rabbi of one of the largest Reform temples in the world, based in New York City. Her name is Angela Bookdahl, and she's spoken very eloquently about the challenges that she's faced walking into synagogues or into Jewish spaces and having people question her status because she doesn't, quote, look Jewish. In fact, one of her favorite experiences she detailed in a High Holiday sermon recently was when she was walking on the street in New York City, and one of the young Lubavitcher teenagers who are out there trying to get people to do Jewish things asked her, "Are you Jewish?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And she was so excited to get the question because all too often this category of looking Jewish has pushed her away from being acknowledged for not only who she is by birth, but who she is by education, by profession, and by chosen community. So to understand how we got to this point of all this Jewish diversity, we need to go back to the beginnings of Jewish history and look at our origins. Now, the Jewish people began as a national group. We were a territory. We were the people who lived in Judea. And when we had religious rules, they applied to everybody living in the territory. So if you look up the traditional rules around matzah, as we're heading into Passover season, it would say that there is no matzah, no leavened bread, only matzah can be found in all the houses in the territory, not just the Jewish houses. It applied to offering sacrifices at the temple. Those could be open to people who were not part of the Judeans, but who were living in the territory. They were the ger, the resident alien. The Hebrew lagur means to reside, to live. So a ger was the person who lived in the area with you, the green card holder, as we might say it today in America. There was a national god, of course, and a national cult based in the national capital of Jerusalem, but there was no separation of religion and government back in those days, and some would argue we're having challenges with that even today. But certainly back in the ancient world, if you were part of the Judean nation, you followed the Judean ritual practices, you obeyed the Judean ritual rules. There were certain sacrifices you could not offer, but others you were able to offer, and you obeyed the commandments of the Judean God. We evolved actually out of Canaanite culture in the rural highlands of the land of Israel, where the Canaanite cities and the coast followed Canaanite polytheistic practice. Gradually, the Judean highlands evolved into a more what we call a henotheistic practice, worshiping only one God, not necessarily denying there were other gods, but remember in the Ten Commandments, it says, "I am a jealous God, do not have any other gods before me." That's saying I'm the most important God and you should only look at me. Doesn't make sense to be jealous if you're the only one. So the fact that he's a jealous God indicates this evolution out of a polytheistic background, but also out of a background where it was a territorial identity, and this was the national God, the one you should focus on. And you were Judean. And there's a famous passage during a siege of Jerusalem around the year 700 BCE, where the people of Jerusalem describe the language they speak, but they don't call it Ivrit, they don't call it Hebrew. They say, we speak Yehudit, we speak Judean, or we might even say today, Jewish. That's their national language, like it's their national culture, and it's a territorial identity. Now, where this becomes complicated is after that nation is conquered. It manages to survive the Assyrian Empire by offering appeasement and atonement, and then that's how they get out of that siege in Jerusalem, actually, around the year 700 BCE. But when the Babylonian Empire appears, they're not able to survive. Jerusalem is destroyed. The elites are exiled into Babylon, and here comes a stroke of priestly genius. Historically, when your national god was destroyed, they lost, and the other nation's god won. And so you might even be inclined to start worshiping that other nation's God because you want to worship the one in charge. And you might still have private requests for yours, who's now subordinate, but it's not as important as the one who won. So the stroke of priestly genius that took place in Jewish culture was the reversal of fortune claim, that if we lost, it's because our God wanted us to lose. It's not that your God won. Our God is more powerful than all the other gods. He runs history, and we messed up. So he punished us by allowing us to lose, either by withdrawing his protection or even actively bringing the Babylonians to smite us and to cause us to atone for our sins. Now, what that stroke of genius allows you to do is to maintain your faith and theology, and by the way, support of your priests, even after a national loss. And it also enables a shift in the religious identity, where your religious identity can become an ethno-religious identity, where it's not only who you are and where you live, but it could also be where you're from. It could also be the God that you choose to worship, even if you're not there. You see, the Hebrew God of this period still had a place he wanted to live. He still had his seat in Jerusalem. Remember that one of the words for temple is the Beit El, the house of God. Well, he still had a house. It was still to be built in Jerusalem. And in fact, they would rebuild the temple and create what's called the Second Temple after they returned from Babylonian exile around the year 500 before the Common Era. But even while they were in exile, they found a way to maintain their identity as this ethno-religious synthesis, where they were a people from a place, but they also had a God that tied them together, even if they weren't in that place. In fact, they provided a rationale for why the God allowed them to not be in the place where they really belonged. They were in exile, but they were in a divinely ordained exile that would be redeemed in a divinely ordained timescale. But in the meantime, of course, you did have the challenge of living among other peoples. And this is why one of the priests in charge in this time period, whose name was Ezra, had to enact some rules. And here's where we get some of the both inspiring and obnoxious texts in the Jewish experience. So in Ezra, the book of Ezra, chapter 9, which is near the end of the Hebrew Bible, we have a complaint. And the complaint is, this is from the, in verse 1, you can see, the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land, following their abominations. All these nations, the Canaanites and Hittites and so on, they were supposed to wipe them out, and they didn't. And now, in verse 2, they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mixed themselves with the peoples of the lands. Notice that phrasing, holy seed. Holy religion, seed, ethnicity. And so it's a combination of religious and ethnic. That's that ethno-religious identity. And so now what should we do? Ezra prays to God. We have forsaken your commandments. The land which you go to possess is an unclean land, the prophet said, and do not give your daughters to their sons, and don't take their daughters for your sons, nor seek peace and prosperity forever, that you may be strong, you to go to the land and leave it as an inheritance. We were exiled. We had suffered for our sins, and we're still sinning, and we need to fix it. You've punished us less than our iniquities deserve and given us a remnant. Are we breaking your commandment again? He goes on. Won't you be angry with us? Now, well, Ezra prayed and made confession. They gathered together all the great men, and Ezra gave them hope by proclaiming what Shechaniah, the son of Yechiel, suggested to him. And this is the last underlined part. We have trespassed against our God, married foreign women of the peoples of the land. Yet there is now hope for Israel. Let us make a covenant to put away all the wives and those who are born of them, according to the counsel of my Lord and those who tremble at the commandment. Let it be done. We will be courageous and do it. Now, what makes this uncomfortable, of course, is this is a very strong anti-intermarriage statement, but it's also a sense of ethnic purity, almost racism, to say that we are the holy seed and we should not mix with other peoples. There's no provision here, by the way, for converting them. Couldn't you theoretically, if you're marrying your son to their daughter, simply convert their daughter to your religion and then she's in the religion and no big deal? No, there's something here that gets into the ethnic, biological, racial level that makes us uncomfortable, but is also a core part of the Jewish tradition. Now, we should also recall that at the same time that the book of Ezra is being put together, around the year 500, maybe 450 BCE, after the return from Babylonian exile, there's another book being written that has a very diametrically opposed perspective on this. It's called the Book of Ruth, which many scholars date back to this period as well. And in the book of Ruth, Ruth is a Moabite, in fact, from the land of Moab. And you'll notice at the very beginning of this passage, the Moabites were one of those people you were supposed to stay away from. And yet in the book of Ruth, they not only go to Moab, they marry Moabite women, and Ruth becomes the paradigm of loyalty. She goes with her mother-in-law even after her husband has died, and she says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And in fact, she becomes the grandmother of King David. So there's an argument in Ezra saying we're a holy seed, we should not mix with the others. There's an argument in the book of Ruth that that the religion might take precedence over the ethnos, and you can join this community even from the Moabites. Although she's doing a double conversion there, you'll notice in Ruth, your people are my people and your God is my God. Again, it's ethnos and religion. Now, this became even more complicated during the Hellenistic era. We're going to talk more about that in the second half of today's class, because during the Hellenistic period, Jews identified as Jewish, they were still part of that holy seed, but now they were mixing themselves with the peoples of the land in cultural and religious and philosophical ways. They were changing what they wore. They were changing how they cut their hair. They might have even been changing how they cut their sons by modifying circumcision or even choosing not to do it. Now, there were some in the Jewish community that resisted this. They were the pietists. We call them today the Maccabees. There were others who were happy to participate in this Greco-Roman culture of the period. And again, we'll explore more about that later on. But in the end, what I wanted to highlight are two features of that Hellenistic period at this stage, and we'll come back to it later. The first is that there's a word that we've learned from Greek that we use even today in the Jewish world. It's the word diaspora. There's a big difference between being in exile and being in diaspora. If you are in exile, you are not in the land where you belong. You should be somewhere else. You're a stranger where you are, and you need to go home. If you're a diaspora comes from two Greek roots. Dia is to spread out, and spore is like seeds. So a diaspora is a spreading of seeds. And when you plant seeds in different soil, they grow, both according to their genetics, but also according to their what's called epigenetics, how the environment affects how those genetics are expressed and how much water they get and how much sun they get. The environment makes a difference too. So diaspora actually began with Greek city-states emerging all around the Mediterranean basin, being somewhat different in Egypt and in Syria and in Iran and Persia at the time, and so on, and in Asia Minor along the coast of what is today Turkey. All those different Greek diaspora communities were a little bit different because the seeds grew a little bit differently. They were part of a broad Hellenistic culture, but they were unique in their own way. And we begin to see the seeds of a Jewish diaspora where the Jews in Babylonia who stayed, whom we'll also talk about this afternoon, largely consider themselves in exile. The Jews in Alexandria might well have considered themselves as a diaspora, where they were rooted in their Greek Jewishness in Egypt, even as they had a homeland and a temple they supported in the land of Israel. The second feature of this period that's worth noting is that the fact that the Jews were mixing culturally with the people around them also meant that people around them could experience Jewishness. The Torah was translated into Greek, for example, and many of the sermons offered in these Hellenistic synagogues may well have been done in Greek. And what wound up happening was a number of non-Jews would come to listen or to see what was happening in these Jewish meeting houses. They became known as God-fearers, who wanted to sympathize with the Judaic approach. They liked the monotheism. They liked some of the promises of redemption at the end of time. But there were some barriers to fully joining the Jewish community. One included connections with their family that they would have to be cutting off, because again, when you joined the Jewish people, you were joining both a people and the religion. Sometimes the dietary issues were a challenge for them to adjust to, and for men, if they were Greek, they had not been circumcised, and having to do so as an adult is a real challenge. Although I have heard a joke that points out, if you think that circumcision is not a big deal, just keep in mind that every child that's circumcised can't walk for at least a year. I mean, they're usually circumcised at 8 days, so maybe they weren't walking anyways. But it was certainly a serious bar or inhibition for men to join these Jewish communities, although some did. Scholars speculate that the large growth in Jewish population in this period during the late Roman era in occupying the land of Israel must have come from some kind of conversion process, because it's much larger than one would expect with natural growth. So there may well have been God-fearers that were willing to jump the line and cross into full Jewish identity, but there were others who were simply sympathetic to it. These, of course, provide a fertile ground for Christianity and its proselytism, because in Christianity, you didn't need to do the circumcision or the diet issues, and you could still get all the benefits of written revelation, monotheism, and ultimate redemption. Be that as it may, the Hellenistic experience of having a foot in both worlds for the Jews and having other people looking in on your experience will become very common in these diaspora communities. In the end, we developed a rabbinic consensus, and the consensus was that there was a Jewish ethnic identity based on the concept of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and yet there was also a sense of an eternal covenant as the chosen people, with a specific set of laws and rules that this people had to follow based on the revelation that created the covenant. This is the concept of having a halakha. Halakha literally means the path, the way of walking. Halach is to walk. And so the halakha, the Jewish law, defined every part of life. It defined ritual behavior, it defined belief, it defined action, it defined ethics, it defined marital laws, it defined purity laws, it defined contract law. It was all encompassing. But that was a law given particularly to this special people, to this holy seed, which was an ethnic identity passed down by biology, by your parentage, specifically by your mother in rabbinic definitions. And so the Talmud, which became the core collection of this Jewish legal discussion, included many rules, but it also included the ability to ask questions. People often celebrate the fact that Jewish culture allows you to ask questions. However, you couldn't necessarily ask any question. So here we have an example of some of the boundaries that were set on how far you could ask and how far you could go. It says in Mishnah Sanhedrin, which is an early collection of rabbinic sayings, all Israel have a portion in the world to come. And it has a supporting quote from Isaiah. And these are they that shall have no share in the world to come. So I guess all of them except for these people. And what are those violations that would cause you to have no share in the world to come? The first two says there is no resurrection of the dead in the Torah. Well, that does actually make sense. If you don't believe in the afterlife, maybe you don't deserve it. But the second one is the one who says the Torah is not from heaven. And the third one is the Apikoros, the heretic. Rabbi Akiva adds, anyone who reads the heretical books or utters a charm over a wound. Abba Shaul says, anyone who orders the divine name according to the letters. So you can be canceled from the Jewish future, the redemption, if you disagree with the resurrection of the dead being in the Torah, if you disagree with the Torah having divine origin and authorship, and an apikoros. And we'll talk more about the apikoros, the Jewish heretic, again in our second hour. But also, if you read an outside book, if you do magic, if you say the divine name, there are a lot of ways that you can in fact be canceled. And that's simply part of the reality of a bounded community with both religious and ethnic identities. There was a provision for excommunication, for cherem, that could have you kicked out of the community. In theory, can you really be kicked out of an ethnicity? Well, that's again highlighting the overlapping identities. And so Here's another example of a statement of belief, because different thinkers in different times and places would tip the balance more or less towards religion or ethnicity. So Maimonides wrote up 13 principles of faith, each of which begins, "I believe with perfect faith." And this is, by the way, recited in the weekly Orthodox prayer service. "I believe with perfect faith that the Creator creates and directs all the creations. I believe with perfect faith that he is unique. There is no uniqueness like his at all. He has no body and is unaffected by the body. I believe the prophecy of Moses was true. I believe that all the Torah was given to Moses. The Torah will not be exchanged. There will not be another Torah written." By the way, you can see some of the interreligious dialogue going on in Maimonides' days versus Christians with the New Testament or versus Muslims with the Quran and Muhammad. Number 10, "I believe that the Creator knows the doings of humanity and all their thoughts. He rewards those who keep his commandments and punishes those who break them. And I believe in the coming of the Messiah, even though he tarries, and a resurrection of the dead at the end of days, whenever the Creator decides." So these are statements of belief. And if anybody ever tries to tell you Judaism doesn't care what you believe, you can pull this out and say, well, actually, there are aspects of traditional Judaism that do care what you believe. And not only because, to be fully counted as a minyan, for example, there are some belief criteria in some communities, but also because this is a ritual to recite this as a daily prayer service. And it's a statement of belief. It's a creed. So there are versions of Judaism that highlight creed and are not only focused on deed and what you do. All right. So this is the reality of Jewish life, that it's been this combination of ethnic and religious identity. Historically, Jews lived in Jewish communities. They had what we could call collective rights, but not individual rights. So the Jewish community as a whole would negotiate with the ruling power, be it a king at a high level nationally or a duke or some other kind of feudal lord more locally, for the right for the Jewish community to reside there. The Jewish community was taxed as a collective community. The Jewish community had rules to follow that the Jews themselves would enforce on their own members. In many places, by the way, where Jews did live in a walled ghetto, the locks to the ghetto were on the inside because the Jews locked themselves in for their own safety. And they were happy to live in their own walled community, both walled physically, but also walled mentally and ritually. And this experience of having these collective rights reinforced the fact that they were a separate religious, legal, and we might say today ethnic or national identity with high barriers on both sides. You see, Jewishness was a total identity. It was what language you spoke, it was your material culture, the clothing you wore, the food you ate, where you lived, what jobs you were allowed to pursue, and your sense of who are my people. If you were a Jew living in Poland in the 1400s, your people were other Jews. It was not your Polish neighbors living in other communities. And the same was true for Jews living in Italy and Jews living in the Ottoman Empire. They were Ottoman subjects, but they weren't Ottoman citizens in the way that we understand citizenship. And so their community was the Jewish community, and it was a total identity. Now, what makes things complicated is when we get to the modern period of emancipation and enlightenment.